What a brief. Solve the housing crisis. Well, I'm glad I sat down this morning with a calculator and did some numbers, so I think I've got it sorted. So I'll deliver that message after lunch. That's that way you can enjoy your lunch for now. It's a real pleasure and a delight to be here. And thank you, President, thank you, Don, for the invitation to be here and to talk with you today. It is a very big moment in my mind for Australia, the biggest one potentially, I'm going to be a little melodramatic here, in the last 70 years, I think, in my mind. Because the housing crisis to me, as I'll explain, to me is not about houses. Oh, that's funny you say. It's actually about who we are as Australians. It's our cultural change that we're trying desperately to navigate and understand right now. And as you can imagine, in this world of rampant media and all the rest, we're getting a lot of signals pushing us in all sorts of directions. So the messaging is very unclear right now. And I think our immediate challenge is to try and sort out the mess, separate the signal from the noise, and try and really understand what it is that we as Australians are trying to imagine ourselves into as a future. And of course, the house is the proxy for that. It is the embodiment of who we are as individuals, of who we are as a nation. And so I think in that sense, and the houses too, this is the difficulty actually. The core of it is, the house is an emotional proposition, first and foremost. It is right here. And then secondly, it's up here. And that's what makes this conversation so challenging, because you just can't separate those two things. As best you may try, they will continue to walk over each other, those two ideas of the heart and the mind. So I think that's one of those things we keep in mind. We're recognising that that is actually where we are. How do we then walk into this emotional conversation, one that touches us all, but in incredibly different ways? One that is immensely personal to who we are, but one that actually then obviously has this huge social currency around it and change that's implied. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and set up where we are very briefly. How do we get here? Where I think we are. I want to give that a little bit of context that might be a little bit different to what you've been reading in the press. And then I want to sort of give you 3 or 4 ideas of, I'm going to say, framing. So I'm going to give you a problem, but I'm going to wrap it in a sort of a silver lining of optimism. How does that sound to talk? I'm going to do all that in 37 minutes and 44 seconds. Great. We do, don't we? I totally agree. So to move on, so I guess the other thing to say is my perspective here as a professor of architecture, I have my academic hat, but the other side, the grand design side and the television side, means that I'm actually, as we just heard, in the homes of well over 100 different families across Australia at the moment, or over the last 3 or 4 years, as they are going through exactly this conversation in very real time, in very real terms. So in that sense, I have had that privilege to have those very emotional conversations. When people cry on TV, they're actually crying. We're not making that up. I'm not sticking them with a pin to sort of get them to be emotional. They're very real, very raw, up here sort of level emotions coming out because, and it gets me every time too, so I'm a sucker for all that stuff. But in saying that, I've done Restoration Australia, so I've seen the old become new story. Grand Design's Transformations is the small, struggling person, mostly, try to sort of do something small with limited means. And then the Grand Designs. And Grand Designs in the day of Kevin, let's say, back in the early days of Kevin McLeod, was all about big, specky houses. Today, we're really trying to move that conversation into the idea of big, grand ideas about housing. So as you might have seen from the first episode last Thursday, an earthship built in Tasmania. The whole idea there is around, of course, sustainability. An average cost, not a cheap build, but an average build for a family that actually had sort of no recourse but to more or less do it themselves. They were kind of priced out of Melbourne. They just couldn't afford to have a house around their friends in Melbourne. That's the reality of their world. And so they had to find an alternative. So they kind of made it up as they went along. So in that sense, the ideas trump everything else. I've got to be careful with that word, don't I? The ideas supersede the other realities, yeah. So that's where I'm coming from. So restorations like this is Nimidabel, which is an incredible story. Adaptive reuse is one of my favourite topics. We'll talk about that another time, perhaps. This is a little post office in Carlton River in Tassie as well, turned from an old post office into a family home. Things like this. This is on the Grand Design's transformation space. Someone who wants to turn that into a French chateau. You can see how well that's going to go. A really nice story that's in this season about a very good Sydney architect, Ed Littman, and his family home in Dover Heights. And he had the property, inherited it from mum and dad. Lots of big, deep family memories in there. But his decision with his partner Sonia was not to do the thing that most of us would immediately think about, which was to maximise the benefit of the site in that very wealthy area of Sydney. He said, no, we're actually going to downsize. We're going to cut off 3 bedrooms. We're going to have 2 bedrooms, and we're going to have a modest, small house on this block, and that's enough. And they decided that, and they made that commitment. And actually, they spent a reasonable amount of money, a few $1 million. In that part of the world, not so much, relatively speaking. But the decision in that, from a real estate perspective, was nuts. From a lifestyle perspective, absolutely A+. So that's the kind of situation we're in right now. I thought that's kind of very instructive. It would be nice to have the choice. And another one too, the climate. I mean, we'll touch on the climate a few times, and I think that's something that that's a new actor. We just cannot ignore the climate as a star actor in the current theatre of housing that is playing out. And the climate will be heard, no matter what we do. The climate will have its say. So our challenge is, how do we listen, and then how do we respond, which is pretty obvious to say, but something that we have to keep actually reminding ourselves. You don't hear that when Prime Minister Albanese says we want to build 1.2 million homes in Australia. We're not hearing so much about where are those homes, where are the appropriate places to build those homes. Why would we build the same homes that we've been building for the last 50 years when there clearly is a problem with those homes? So what are the alternatives? And that's where my ear is sort of listening. That's what I'm really hunting for. And I'm searching all the academic contexts. I'm out there in the industry, trying very hard to find those models that may have an impact into the future. And that's the whole idea of the home front, as you heard earlier on. So, all right. So what kind of housing crisis are we in? Just to put it bluntly, the residential house estate that is Australia is about 50% of GDP. So anything that happens in the housing market happens to Australia. This isn't a sidebar. This is not some sort of nice idea. This is effectively half of our entire wealth in the country that we are talking about. So change, any change, even small change, is consequential. That's the first thing. The real reason behind the housing crisis, as it's been explained in the press mostly, is demonstrated in this graph. I won't do too many of these, don't worry. But I think it's important to understand that this is just in the last year and then forecasting to next year, and it's the disparity between average income and average house price. And that number has been growing at a ridiculous rate over the last 10, 20 years. And you can see just in the last, from last year to forecasting to next year in Sydney, almost a full multiple of 1 extra time, the average income to service and pay for a kind of an average home. So this idea of how much we earn, how much our houses are worth, where that sits across Australia, it's not a good picture anywhere. It's dire here in Sydney. Surprisingly, it's not as bad in Melbourne, which I don't quite understand, because my understanding is Melbourne prices are much the same as here in Sydney. But there you go. I just had, being a Sydney boy, I just had to point that out. But then, we just don't want that number to go any further. And as Alan Kohler says in his whole response to this, is like, well, actually, what is our task here? Is this what we're trying to fix? I mean, he's not talking about houses. He's talking about the disparity between income and house cost. Is that a number that we should be targeting? And I think it's a very reasonable question to ask, because if that is actually the goal of all of this, then we've got to get much, much more serious and much more aggressive about our economic policy around all of this. Yes, we can talk to the banks. We should talk to the banks. But that's one sort of part of the conversation. But I'm going to leave Alan to champion that particular message. That's his expertise, and he's very, very good at that. And I'm going to sort of focus on the opportunity of the other side of that. To me, and actually I asked Alan this point blank on the radio, so what sort of crisis is this? And he says it's clearly a supply and demand issue, and that's what you hear coming from the politicians as well. I don't believe that's true. And I'll tell you why, mainly because of those numbers up there. We have about 11 million houses in Australia right now. About 10% of that, 1 million houses on any given evening are empty. Just think about that. 1 million houses around the country have no one in them on any given evening, for whatever reason, all sorts of very real and very practical reasons. But that's the reality. And you add to that, Hugh Mackay talks about this, we've become a nation of spare rooms, because when you add up all the spare bedrooms that implies, there's 13 million spare bedrooms around the country. So if you talk about we need to build more, I'm not sure that's really the crux of it, because we've got the inventory is out there. Yeah, the access to that inventory is a whole other story. But the actual inventory itself is a different matter. So it's a convenience for politicians to say, let's build 1.2 million houses. And actually, if you're listening to the news in the Philippines or in Taiwan or in a whole host of other countries around the world, as I'll talk about in a minute, they're saying exactly the same thing. Oh, solution to the housing crisis, we have to build more houses. Surely it's supply and demand. That's very easy to digest. It's very palatable. It's a very kind of simple problem dynamic that the average person can understand. Unfortunately, as we all know, this is the furthest thing from a simple problem to solve. So I sort of tend to put that in the great marketing, not exactly the solution kind of bucket in my mind. Yeah. Yes, it is. I mean, it is. The supply is part of it, but it's not actually the crux of the problem. So a nation of spare rooms. I don't really like that title very much at all. Hugh's an amazing writer, and you may have come across his work in the past. And he sort of says, we've been creating housing at twice the rate. We've been building, but we've been shrinking as a family size. This is the other part of this problem, or issue, if you like. So what used to be about 4.5 people per household back in the 1900 is now about 2.5, 2.4. So our houses are getting bigger, but our population or density in those houses is getting smaller. So proportionally, our houses are growing around us at about 4 times what they were. Yeah, when we were in a sort of state of they're 4 times bigger than they were 100 years ago. What that means is we're just hungry for space. We think we need, culturally, that space for whatever reason. There's other implications here about how many people and social connections that you'll come to in a minute. But the idea that this sort of, again, our houses are growing, our families are shrinking, this is another sort of disparate moment where we have to kind of come to these and understand how to rethink the best fit for those new families. I did want to touch on homelessness in that context very briefly because it's one of those things which is part of this problem but not actually directly talked about. Yeah, and I do think, and I mean this, I think as a wealthy nation that we are, the wealthy nation that we are, to have 122,000 is the current statistic that goes around. That was from the 2021 census. To have 122,000 people out homeless on any given night in Australia is to me abhorrent. It's something that we can change. And as I'll show in a second, it's something that we can change. We changed it in COVID. Yeah, when that happened, we suddenly got everyone off the street. Melbourne streets had no one sleeping rough. And people were found accommodation in all sorts of different ways that were emergency accommodation, yes, but that was sort of emergency accommodation for a few weeks at a time, demonstrating that actually if we have the will, there is the way. Yeah, it's just the way. That's it. So that really raises a much harder question to ask, which is why don't we have the will? What is getting between us and that moral decision, if you like, and I'm going to put it in moral terms, to solve homelessness right now? I point to the example of Finland. In 2008, they had a thing called the Housing First policy. Now, this is a really smart move. They reduced housing by 70% in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. So they said homelessness is a problem in Finland. We're a kind of a state that thinks that that's important. We're going to try and do something about that. What they recognised too, that was the core of the homelessness issue is that once you have stable accommodation of any type around you, all of life's other problems, addiction, work, employment, these kinds of things become suddenly possible. So to solve the bigger issue, you start with the thing which is the root cause of it all, which is to put a permanent roof over people's heads. Not luxury accommodation by any stretch of the imagination, but they did this, and as you can see up there, 70%. What they also found, against the critics who said, oh, that's horrendously expensive. Surely that's going to cost us way too much. Actually, I didn't have a number for it, but they found that actually by doing that housing, they reduced costs in servicing the health issues and all the other sort of social services that wrap around homelessness. They reduced the costs in that significantly, and more than enough to pay for the initiative to put roofs over people's heads. So that's quite interesting, and I think what's interesting now too is there's a little bit of pushback on that now in Finland, as I understand. It's been in play now for nearly 20 years. But it's done an amazing job in changing a real issue. Why can't we do that? That's a very genuine question. Why can't we do that? I'll leave it with you. You can solve that over lunch for me. Then that gets us back to then just to finish this issue about homelessness. This is a question of why can't we make this decision? So these are the two statistics though that really bother me in the Australian context. The first one. A survey that was done in the esteemed poll of the Sydney Morning Herald in 2023 was aimed at under 35 Australians, under 35 years of age Australians. 72% of those surveyed said that they could not imagine buying a house in their lifetime. People under the age of 35, 72%. Let's just leave that right there in front of you. More than 2/3 of Australians' generation under the age of 35 can't imagine buying a home in their life. If anything says generational change, that number does it for me. That kind of anchors that idea of generational perspectives really loudly and clearly. So that startled me when I saw that, because I had, like probably most of us, assumed that most people would still aspire to a home, and the average home would be kind of the typical way. It was how to get there was the issue, but actually that's not the issue. The issue is actually the home itself actually is being challenged or is up for grabs in these terms. Because if that sort of 72% of people don't imagine that home in their future, what are they imagining? What house? What is their idea of home for that generation? That's such a good question to ask. And I'd love to talk to people more about that because I think they have some really radical and interesting ideas. A lot of them come from necessity. Fair enough. They have to change. They can't afford it. They have to find a workaround to the current system. But some of it, and I'm going to sort of put an aberrant number on this, let's say 30%, are sort of looking at that as a different opportunity. You know what? Actually, I quite like living amongst more people. I quite like having friends who are nearby. I quite like living in multi-generational homes, or with my mum and dad, or with my grandma and grandpa, or sharing the backyard with the neighbours, or sharing a laundry with the people in the flat 2 doors down. So these ideas are actually not just necessary steps in a different direction. They're also now becoming, I would say, I'm being optimistic here, but they're becoming in some ways even a bit aspirational. Can I be so bold? A little bit like, yeah, what if? So the idea of sort of like an isolated family in their sort of 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom number with the carport out the front, that sort of family with the fence around, that model of isolation of the family, the walls of the castle that we put up on those suburban blocks, that's something that this generation is saying, maybe not. Maybe not. Okay, so we're at the very early days in this conversation, but that's really interesting. Second number that really bothers me about this is the other end of the generational spectrum. 14% of retirees are going into their retirement without having serviced their mortgage, still having their mortgage, carrying their mortgage through with them. In the decade before retirement, the number of people who still are servicing a mortgage has doubled effectively. So the idea of paying off your house before you retire so you can have a good retirement, that is becoming harder and harder and harder and harder to do. I'm Gen X. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm Generation X. So that kind of 50 to 65-year-old, that's my demographic. So people at my age, in my situation, we're going to retire with a mortgage on our shoulders. Now think about what that means in terms of, well, what does that mean? I have to work longer. I'm not retiring at 65. I'm retiring at 75. Yeah? Okay, well, if I'm doing that, I'm not going on my holidays and all that kind of stuff. I'm not having a nice retirement. But I have to find work that's appropriate for someone my age with my skills in this kind of situation. A whole other sort of tier of implications become very quickly to the surface around that particular number. So if you think of it that way, we've got issues at the front end of the generational spectrum. We've got issues at the other end of the generational spectrum. And of course, we've got the X's and everyone else in the middle trying to sort of, the sandwich generation, trying to sort of help on both fronts. So this is what we're in. I think those two numbers are kind of difficult. I also want to say this is actually not an Australian problem. Now, this is something that we don't talk about very much here in Australia, and I'd like to kind of like expand the field just for a second. The UN Habitat is all over this, and you can see that number up there. By 2030, I'm going to read it out because it's startling. By 2030, UN Habitat estimates that 3 billion people, about 40% of the world's population, 40% of the world's population, will need access to adequate housing. This translates to a demand for 96,000 houses a day for the next 5 years globally. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm in this architecture game, and I can't imagine building and finishing 96,000 houses a day around the planet. That seems like an awful lot of inventory to need to motivate, yeah? So that's the kind of the global situation. But the way the World Economic Forum talks about this, it's not so much, again, this issue of we don't have the houses. It's that we don't have the houses in the right places. You know, work has moved to the cities. Rural areas have become sort of barren. You know the story about Japan, you know, and all the cities are growing, but the countryside is shrinking, it's being emptied out, sort of ghost towns in sort of small Japanese villages. That story is written all around the world. Same reasons. The work is over there. The young generations are going to the work. They're not staying on the farm. So the houses are in the wrong spot. So it's not so much, again, inventory, but location, the proximity. I do recommend this particular video by Jonathan Reckford, who's the CEO for Habitat. You can just Google that, and I'll make this information available to you at some point. I don't know how, Don, but we'll talk about that. Who sort of lays all that out very, very clearly. Very, very interesting terms. So this issue that we're trying to solve here in Australia, yes, it's something that our colleagues in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia writ large, across the whole world, are really struggling with in their own ways. You'll hear about the affordability crisis in the United States. It has a lot of similarities to what we're going through, but it's a different sort of cultural context, as I think we're all pretty aware. So I think we also just have to recognise that what we do here will have implications more broadly, but equally we should be looking out there for those who are solving their problems to bring them back home, which is why on the home front, I was very keen to talk to people from both the United States and from Denmark about their particular aspirations. And to me, they kind of represent two ends of the political spectrum. The socialists on one hand and the sort of like the individualists on the other, if you like. And how do those two sort of different cultural contexts respond to the similar kind of issues? Australia has changed. I mean, again, we kind of get back to what kind of houses are we building, and just a sort of quick recognition that, you know, this or that is not really so much of who we are anymore. We're an urban nation, you know that, but our family dynamic has changed. I think this is really fundamental to the house for obvious reasons. Right now, 43% of us are in what we'd call a nuclear family, or some version of it, yeah? There's a bit of a catch to that, and I'll get to that in a second. But what surprises me, or not surprises me, but what I think is notable is that those other two statistics, couples with no children and lone parent family or single person homes, represent, therefore, let's call it 60%. Yeah, round up a little bit. 60% of Australia. So when we think about building houses, 1.2 million houses, the image that comes to your mind, I bet, is that sort of detached house on a suburban block, right? That's certainly what the politicians are hoping you're imagining. But actually, that is not the people who need those houses. What we need are houses for those singles, for those couples with no kids, for those blended families, for those types of families that are not the nuclear typical family from the 1950s, because we are not that anymore. So that's a really hard thing for us to swallow, because we really have built an entire kind of cultural mythology around those particular ideas. That's, I think, the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges confronting us in the housing situation right now. A recognition of who we are right now as Australians. Interestingly, two facts that came out of that are not in the slides. One, when they did the Nightingale housing in Melbourne, which was sort of like an affordable housing situation done by Breathe Architecture with other colleagues, they were surprised. They built it thinking, we need to get policemen and women and firefighters close to the centre of the city where they can afford to live in a reasonable rent. You know, that kind of thing was their aim. They thought, we'd probably have some students in there, maybe some graphic designers. Actually, what they found was that the most desperate group of people trying to get in there were single women over the age of 55. Yeah? I see the nods, and I hear the nods around the room. Shouldn't have surprised anybody. But that is the group. They're like, well, you know, I'm over 55, I'm a woman, I'm sort of at the end of my professional career perhaps, I don't know what I'm going to do going forward into retirement, my husband has left or passed or something, I'm on my own for whatever reason. I have no real means that are obvious to me in front of me to go and pay for a different housing situation. I don't know what to do about that. And so there's this sort of big void for that particular group. And that was a big number of people that were interested in that Nightingale housing model for exactly that reason. That's one version. The other one is the couples with children. In that, we sort of have the blended family stories. Yeah. So as we have divorces and all the rest. So I'm sure we all have colleagues and friends who have the kids 2 nights a week, and then you're on the weekends, or some version of that where you're kind of swapping and changing. So even that dynamic represents a very different kind of house to be built to accommodate that sort of behavioural pattern, if you like, of a family, which is a very common thing. All of it which is sort of under the radar. I did say I'd talk about the climate very briefly. Another thing about the houses that we build is where we build them. We talked about adjacency a moment ago. These kinds of numbers also are sort of startling. As you probably realise, if you live on the northern beaches around Collaroy, you probably can't insure your home anymore because the waterfront there is falling into the ocean. that despite what they're trying to do to build seawalls and all the rest, nature will win, I suspect. So in that same sort of way, we're seeing people building on the Brisbane River, which floods. This was up in Taree last year. We've had Lismore. I mean, the list goes on. Bushfires and all the rest. We're tending to build back in places like Lismore, thinking that, oh, well, the worst is over. You know, surely it won't happen again, surely, right? And yet the frequency of that 100-year flood is sort of coming in years of, decade multiples now, or even less. Every 5 years, we're getting a 100-year flood, that kind of thing. I was speaking to some colleagues who are doing research up there around these sort of issues, and they've said, no, we've just got to completely ignore the environmental sort of predictions these days, because no one knows what the reality of the next flood is going to be, when it's going to be. So those numbers are, they're guidelines at the very, very, very best, so they really don't know how to operate. The whole conversation then, just to sort of stay with Lismore for a second, how do we move a city, how do we move a whole town like Lismore from where it is on the river there up into a higher ground so it doesn't get flooded? And that is the most emotional kind of conversation you can have. I've got a friend myself who runs a yoga or a Pilates studio up there. She actually sort of said, well, I wanted to move up the hill a bit, get my business out of town. She's got a business that runs quite successful. But to do that, couldn't afford it. To buy the property where I run my business and not pay insurance because it was uninsurable was actually a cheaper option for me than to do anything else. So she's bought the property knowing it's going to flood in 2 years' time, with the idea that when they renovate that place to make that business work, they can strip it out within about 5 to 10 minutes, put it all on the back of a truck and drive it away, come back when the flood's passed, hose it out with a gurney and set up and start again in like a heartbeat. So that's the kind of strategy. I mean, it's kind of pretty remarkable, right? But to me, that's kind of not a way to run a business. Apparently, that's what they're doing in Lismore. So as I say, BAO, or business as usual, building as usual, BAO is broken. Yeah, BAO is broken in every dimension, financially, environmentally, and all the rest, demographically and all the rest. So sort of just to make the point, is this all we can imagine when we talk about a home in Australia? This is, I'd say, 99% of what people would sort of pop into their minds. Something like this is in Geelong, this little house. Is this all we can build when it comes to Australia? It's sort of stick frame, one at a time, slab on ground, project type home. We can talk about the quality later, but this particular building method represents an entire ecology that supplies this way of thinking, that has huge implications for the financial side, but also, of course, for the longevity of these homes that are built like this, which ain't so good, as you've probably been noticing if you've been listening to the press. And our obsession with size, just to put it out there, I think I've said this before, you may have heard it, until very, very recently, we had the largest, on average, new build homes in the world. In the world. Why? Why? I don't understand. It's like, who needs 6 bathrooms? I don't get that. I don't have 5 cars to park in a garage, I don't want another part of this is this sort of big thing. This gets to the social side of this, and I'll sort of skip to this in a second. When we start to park our kids in bedrooms that have en-suites and walk-in robes of their own, the bedrooms themselves are 20, 30, 40 square metres in size. Huge, getting bigger and bigger. Effectively self-contained apartments within a quote-unquote house where my 13-year-old can grow up. And we wonder why they're retreating there and hitting the social media and not coming out to sort of talk to mum and dad about the news of the day. The house is setting the behavioural patterns for the family. So if you think about it that way, you can kind of re-engineer that family dynamic through the house would be the idea. That loneliness thing, that separation, that social separation is this other underlying current to all of this, which really is, to me, intimately tied to the idea of the house size, why we're building so big. So the consequence is we've removed ourselves from the street, we've detached ourselves from our local community. I'm not going to ask the question, don't show me your hands, but it's a very real question in an audience like this. How many of you know the names of the neighbours on either side of you and on either side of them? And that number is diminishing, 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 to the point where you don't know your neighbours. You know them by sight, but you wouldn't know enough to say, oh, g'day Gary, how you going? Oh, how are the kids? Oh, not bad. Yeah, sorry about the fence. I'll fix that on the weekend. By the way, your tree's overhanging a bit. Can we deal with that? Yeah, no worries. I'll get a hedge clipper up there and knock that over on the weekend. Those conversations, they're not happening like they used to. which means we don't talk to the neighbour. We call the tree bloke who shows up, sort of lops off our side of the tree on the fence, and now we've got a kind of an antagonism almost going to this unknown person which is living, or the unknown family next door. So that's a sort of accentuating, a little local example of accentuating that idea of isolation, and in this case where it really manifests is the idea of loneliness. Now loneliness isn't choosing to live alone, and there are a sizable number of people who choose that for all sorts of very real and very sane reasons. But when you hear that 1 in 3 Australians report being lonely in the last 12 months, and 1 in 6 report being significantly lonely for extended periods of time, you realise we have a real issue on our hands. That loneliness issue is really very, very real. So and the consequence of that, of course, is the flip of that is what then constitutes our idea of community? Where are our social connections? Where have they gone? Why have they disappeared? Are we all, ducking down to the RSL like we used to for a drink on Friday night, or a game of bowls perhaps? Maybe, but less and less and less and less and less. The bridge club, maybe. The book club, my wife's a member of 4 different clubs right now. She's in a book club, an a cappella group, she does a yoga class and all the rest. So she's sort of got her social networks out there, but they're not really local in the sense of neighbours. They're local in the sense of, I go to that thing. I go 4 suburbs over to see my book club friends, So our social connections have changed. They've become less located, if you like, much more open. And in that sense, much more fragile. That's the real issue, hence the loneliness. I have a lot of fear about this. This is straight out of off the internet, so I didn't make this graph. But it is a real issue for us that I think, is part of the big house. So when someone says, well, I like my big house, I deserve a big house. I've worked my life for this big house, and damn it, you will not dissuade me from having a media room which is as big as Hoyt's cinema. And I say, do you really need a big cinema, in your home? There's one down the road. I talked to Sasha Coles about this. He's the principal of Aspect Studios, who's a landscape and urbanist firm, and he sort of makes the case that, well, a lot of that is also that we've stopped designing our streets as public places. They're thoroughfares for cars and convenience, but they're not places to meet, to have those interactions. One of the most lovely pieces of research I found when I was working at Berkeley was when I was working with Intel. They did a thing called the Familiar Strangers work. And the idea that there are a number of people in your neighbourhood, you don't know their names, but their faces are familiar to you. And every time you go get the bus, you might sort of clock that face and that face and that face. And go, oh yeah, I don't know her name, but it's good to see. I like what she's wearing today. You kind of have these little thoughts about the people that are around you. And by that way, you've got this very low level, but very kind of persistent idea of connection, which sort of motivates you and sort of, I guess, creates a sense of community that you then build upon. Yeah? This sort of familiar strangers theory was sort of tested in the 1970s as a psychological study around train stations in the United Kingdom. And from there you kind of understand where this is going. I think those familiar strangers are disappearing. And again, undermining again that whole thing. So I'm not going to sort of talk too much more about loneliness, but I do think that that's something that is part of the issue. I'm not going to go into that. Right, so I think this is, in my mind, no longer than a housing crisis about how many houses do we build, but actually this is a big question about what is the nature of the generational cultural shift that we choose as Australians. I can't put it any more succinctly than that. What are we choosing to do? Because if we don't make the choice, it will happen to us. You can see, it's happening around us already. We're not choosing. We're delaying. We're not making policy. We're not making sensible policy. We're not understanding the breadth of the issue. We're not taking things like homelessness seriously enough to fix it. So it's happening around us, yeah? And we kind of like ducks. We kind of float on the top and paddle very quickly, but we're not actually solving anything right now. I'll get to why I think there's a positive side around that. And I sort of bring that back to I don't really know how to stitch this in just yet. I've only just started trying to make this connection much more explicit. But the Australian principles that we think of ourselves through, ideas like mateship, egalitarianism, fair go, lucky country, all those stereotypes that we all actually sort of use and build upon, all of those, I think, are at the core of the moral decisions and dimensions of the problem that we're now trying to understand. So what does it mean to be an egalitarian society like Australia as a model egalitarian society when we have 122,000 people sleeping rough every night? Yeah, for example, to be the lucky country, she'll be right. Yeah, we're in the lucky country. It'll sort itself out. Don't worry. Just get up in the morning, go to work. You'll be right, mate. you know, that kind of attitude, it won't be right, mate. Yeah, we do need to change that. That needs a different kind of cultural meme to drive that sort of thinking in a different direction. I'm going to say innovation is the nice way of saying get off your ass and do something. Yeah. The other one is the mateship thing. And I mean, this is so deep to who we think we are as Australians. Our mateship sort of, let's call it ethos, for want of a better word. We help each other, we help our mates, we're there for our mates in thick and thin. When we don't know who our neighbours are, how are we even doing that? When was the last time any of us in this room, I mean, actually don't put your hand up again, you could ask this of any audience, when was the last time you went and helped a friend move house or hang a painting or fix the roof or whatever, you know? When was the last time you went and did something for a mate like that, that wasn't going over for dinner or having a drink at the pub, yeah? But actually went and did something with a mate that was helpful. I think, again, that number, I don't have the numbers to prove it, but I think it's going down. You've got an example.
So far, hopefully.
So you're a mate. Excellent, excellent. We've found you. More of that is what we want to see.
1 in a million.
1 in a million. So this is the question about where we are. What kind of Australia do we want? There are solutions. I'm getting to this part, the part where we see a sort of a happy ending to this in some sort of way, some positive way forward, which is what I'd like to try and wrap around this particular issue now that we can understand a bit of what it is in Anthony's terms at least. This is just a sort of a short list of some of the things that people are doing to try and address this. Very piecemeal, very or disintegrated sorts of solutions, but everything from multi-generational family homes, which is a big topic of conversation right now, to things like prefabrication and modular construction to speed up delivery of homes, make it much more cheaper, much quicker, much more quality assured, if you like. Things like long-term rental security. That's a policy issue, and that's a really hard one. But if you don't have long-term security in your rental accommodation, if all the power in that relationship is on the landlord, then that rental situation, that precarious 1/3 of Australians who rent, 1/3 of Australians who rent, they will always be a precarious whole sector of society. That then, as we said, if your housing is not secure, your job is not secure, your livelihood is not secure, your friendships, your social connections, they're not secure. So without that security of tenure over your head, everything else becomes, again, even more brittle. So that's a very kind of concerning kind of number. Bluefield housing is a strategy for infill in sort of older areas, new public housing, pattern book designs I'll get to in a second. So here are 4 things that I think we should be thinking about as a sort of a way to move forward through all of this. This is my attempt to start to put a sort of a silver lining around all of this. The first one is, I think, the most significant, and it comes to me as a professor of architecture. We need to diversify our idea of what home is. And I think I've made that case. We need to not imagine that sort of quarter-acre block with the hills hoist. The movie The Castle, that's probably done more damage to Australian psyche than anything else. Maybe I could put a pin in that and say that was the cause of the housing crisis right there. So exactly that kind of thinking, that needs to be rethought. We need to sort of find the models that broaden the horizons of what a home is in Australia for the next generation to 2050. Where do I look? I look to Indonesia, models like this, a traditional family compound. It's multi-generational living, it's open to the air, it's environmentally friendly, it's absolutely affordable, it's everyday, it's a beautiful way to live, actually. I mean, perhaps not in the middle of Sydney, but in many contexts, this is a very beautiful way to live. And you're living with multiple generations, people are coming and going out of that compound area all the time. Very social, very healthy. Very psychologically and physically healthy for us, yeah? That's one model that I look to. Here's another one about work. This is in Los Angeles. I love this little project. It's a project in downtown LA. It's kind of a WeWork space. But it just shows what you can do, to me, it shows what you can do to a block of land in a highly urbanised area that is completely different to what we've been doing, building rectangles or boxes on rectangles of property. This is a kind of a bunch of lily pads that nestle in a forest, and you go to one of these lily pads as your workplace every day. Now, if that office was available to me somewhere around here in Sydney, I reckon I'd probably go and do that. I'd be quite happy to sort of let my front bedroom go, which is currently my study, let that go, perhaps even consider getting in a renter because I've got this down the road. You know, a bit like the public swimming pool, a bit like the library, a bit like these sort of social, community resources that we might need to reinvest in. Because if they're good, we don't need to have them in our own homes. We don't need to have our own version of them, yeah? So that's another model. This is another one. This is an adaptive reuse in Mumbai. I visited Malik Architects. They had done this in Mumbai as Culture by Design Season 1. It's an old tea factory. This banyan tree anchors the whole thing. It's beautiful. It's been there for centuries. And I don't think Buddha sat under that particular banyan tree, but it sort of has that sort of significance. And they turned it into a cultural hub. Now, the difference between this and any other kind of cultural situation was that they were being quite cheeky. The Indian government isn't very au fait with the idea of dissension or people talking out of school, not towing the party line, etc. But this is a kind of a place that they've managed to get through under the radar to support those kinds of artists, exhibits, discussions, events that might be a bit subversive in any other context. They've called it cultural development, but actually there's a whole different kind of conversation that's been motivated around this, and again, around change in the Indian context, from Mumbai. And this is one of my favourite houses of the moment. This is in Jakarta. It's called Guild House by Raw Architecture. He bought this place in 2016. So I realise I'm going to get over time, so I'm going to go very quickly. He bought this place in 2016. Small practice, Real Rich is his name, the guy. Really lovely guy. Bought the place and said, all right, great, well, I've got my family here, got my wife, got two very, very little kids at that point. The back room, that's where I'm going to set up the office. Office went well, had to expand the office, so he sort of added a bit. Okay, then now I've got 5, 6 people working with me in the back office. Oh, great, yeah, that's working really well. Oh, actually, add a bit more, the office is still growing. Oh, we've got our own little library here for the office. Why don't we open it up to the street? Let the neighbourhood come in and use the library. Okay, so now we've got a library, which is a small public library, which people come and visit on a couple of days a week. The school kids come home from school, stop in at that library in their house, and then go home. Okay, that's a nice little gesture to the neighbourhood. Okay, so that was quite successful. Now people are lining up to get into the library. Next thing you know, there's a dentist's office appears in here to help with oral health care, Then he sort of puts some cows, some goats and some tortoise on the roof, as well as some chickens. So now he's growing his own food on the 3rd story. The office gets bigger again, so he puts another thing on again. On and on and on it goes. He has public talks in his house twice a week for the Indonesian Institute of Architects, or equivalent. When I spoke to him for the Homefront, I caught up with him, I saw this a year ago, he said, you know what, sometimes we've had 2,500 people coming to the house every week. And I'm thinking, now just hold on a second. Can you imagine 2,500 people coming to your house every week to use your library? No. I can't think of anything that would be more radical for an Australian to think about. But it just shows you how calcified our ideals of home are when this is happening sort of effectively up the road. Yeah? And it's a beautiful model. It's a very social thing. I said, God, your house is massive. It's really grown, hasn't it? It says there's more than 200 doors in my house. But there are also about 50 people sort of living there in different ways at any one time. So it's a really incredible, and I don't even have a type to put around it. I can't say it's a boarding house. I can't say it's an office complex. I can't say any of those things. It's something which has sort of organically emerged out of the needs of the community around and an idea of being generous towards that community. So I'm inspired by this house for what it does, not for how it looks. It looks like a bit of a dog's breakfast, if I'm absolutely frank. My well-trained sort of like aesthetic Western eyes look at this and think, oh, if we could get some real order into that, would be great. I'm a bit disturbed by your proportions, my friend. I'm not sure about the gardening regime here. But if you sort of take all that away and understand how it works, who it's working for, a very different kind of thing comes to the top of the pile, and that's something that I think is really interesting. This is a model from the pattern book. Now, you can buy this plan for $1. New South Wales State Government just released the pattern book about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago. And there are 8 different house types, full plan sets, that you can buy for $1 until the 26th of January next year. And if you do that, then you have a fast-track approvals process to build the plan that you buy in the suburb of your choice really around New South Wales, but typically around Sydney. Now, what's so interesting about that is this particular house, I do have a plan, this particular house on an 18-metre frontage, so a typical kind of house block size, actually accommodates 3 houses. It's a very different kind of way of carving up, and it's eminently adaptable. You've got 1, 2, I can show you with my mouse perhaps, 1, 2 and out the back, and 3 along there, houses or homes, if you like, nestled into one block. So the density is at least 3 times your average block. So we're doing well in terms of providing housing without having to kind of go big or go to high rise or any of those sort of things. And what's so nice about this particular plan is that it's eminently adaptable. Any of those boundaries can be changed. I can add a bedroom, subtract a bedroom, change a boundary, and suddenly I've got 4 bedrooms, not 2 or 3. And so those kinds of facts of life as you go along are managed within a kind of a footprint like that. Yes, there are all sorts of legal covenants and so on to manage the ownership regime here, but the idea is that it's possible. And those things are actually only sort of, agreements, if you like. They can be managed, and that's how you kind of build it. And you build that for a sort of a very average, sort of very normal sort of price. Second thing is de-risking innovation. I think we are profoundly risk adverse here in Australia, profoundly risk adverse. And we just have to find a way. I want to take 1% of that 1.2 million houses that Albo is talking about, take that money and give it to the most innovative architects and designers in Australia and say, build a model little suburb for us somewhere so we can all walk through it and see what we think. I think that would be so good. I mean, in terms of advocacy and so on, you're not just sort of seeing it on paper, you're not hearing about it in numbers, you're qualitatively walking through something, feeling how it looks, understanding the space, working out how it's going to operate for your family, imprinting yourself on those kinds of models. So I think that idea of empowering that innovation is something we really have to sort of take seriously. In any normal time, that would be research. But as we all know, research funding is sort of not having a great day right now. So we need a kind of a different mechanism to allow this kind of innovation to happen. That's the next thing, de-risking. And there are some people doing those sort of things. These are some research centres that are actually happening. I mentioned the Lismore Living Labs. That's a kind of a before. That's one of those things where there is some money going through CRCs and so on to try and help with that kind of thinking, if you like, out loud. I do believe we have a platform. People like me in the media, we have a platform. We have to use it. Our peak bodies, like the Royal Society, we have a platform. What do we want to say? Time is to stand up and say it, I think. So that's easier than it's ever been. But it also comes with a lot more responsibility, I would add, than there has ever been, because these issues aren't non-serious, they're not trivial issues. This is an example of a housing estate that was done back in the 1927 by Mies van der Rohe in Stuttgart, the Wiesenhof Siedelung, which is actually a demonstration village that was explicitly set up by Mies van der Rohe, one of modernism's king architects, if I could put it that way. Oh, actually, king's a bad word to use at the moment. Top architects to demonstrate what modernism looked like for the average European. Now, in 1927, the average house in Europe looked nothing like this, of course. You can imagine, right? So this was shockingly futuristic. No one knew what to do with this. But he got a couple of buddies, Gropius and Le Corbusier and people like that, to build houses next to his. He did his own model, and they all had an innovative spray at what does a good, efficient home of the future look like for Europe? What does modernism look like? How does it imprint? So we've got an example from 1927. It's well known. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've just got to do it again, for now. Fourth thing, and this is sort of a little bit more esoteric, and I'm getting to a close. I think this idea of beauty is something that I want to bring back. Now, you're going to say, well, Anthony, it's all been numbers and stats and demographics and things to this point. What is this sort of talk about beauty that's going on? But I sort of link this back to the idea that this is first and foremost an emotional decision. Home is an emotional thing. The idea of beauty, as it's defined for most of us, is that is a beautiful painting. This is a beautiful room because I like the colours, I like the cornices up there. That's a beautiful mantle over there. These ideas of beauty are about things that are around us. But there's a definition of beauty which is sort of coming up, and the definition of beauty has changed through the ages. The one that I'm quite like now is that beauty is actually an exchange. It's something where you feel confident enough to give a little of yourself, to be open to change, because something in front of you has offered a change which is attractive to you. Now, that exchange requires two things. One is that you are open to change. That's the cultural project. Are we open to the kinds of change that we're sort of alluding to here? The other one is there an offering which is beautiful in the sense that it'll make me feel positive, more joyful, more human, if you like, about my world in some way, some deeply, profoundly foundational kind of way. That idea of an exchange in beauty, to me, is so motivating. So I think that's something we can it'll get us away from the Vogue livings. We're not talking about Italian marble for our island benches anymore. We're not sort of having those sorts of conversations. We're talking about a very different kind of active beauty, something about the way we are together, the way we are in a home. And I think that's where we kind of need to transition back to. I'm going to skip that little one, and I want to sort of bring it to a close here. This is a really great quote. I might just read it for you if you're okay, because I quite like this. It's from a philosopher who's currently lives in Paris. He's written a beautiful book, The Philosophy of Home. It came out just last year. Architecture or biology are of little importance. We don't build homes to protect ourselves from bad weather, or to pass down to our children, or to satisfy our aesthetic tastes. Although I'd say most Australians do exactly those three things. Every home is a purely moral reality. We build homes to give a form of intimacy to the portion of the world that makes happiness possible. So with that, I mean, that sort of, to me, brings the emotion to a point, you know. And I want to prove this bastard wrong. This is Robin Boyd, yeah, great theorist, architectural theorist and commentator from the 1950s onwards. And Robin said, us Australians, we shuffle around in the middle in our mediocrity and we're too scared of big ideas. I want to sort of flip the bird to Robin and say, no, might have been who we are, but it's not who we are going forward. So that's him challenging all of us. And I want to accept that challenge and move forward with some big ideas about where houses can go and prove Robin wrong. So a generation of innovation, it's the next 20 years that'll get us to 2050. That's the generation of change. We've got to inspire and motivate that generation to do that change. Otherwise, the change will happen to us rather than it being a change that we choose as a country. Thanks very much.